sister boy should have stuck around.
What do you want, Ringo?
I want your blood. And I want your souls. And I want them both right now.
I don't want any more trouble.
Well, you got trouble! And it starts with you.
I'm not gonna fight you, Ringo. There's no money in it. Sober up. Come on, boys.
Wretched slugs. Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
All right, Lunger. You go to hell. I'll put you out of your misery.
Say wham!
Johnny, don't! No, Johnny, whoa. Get off! Get off!
Don't mind him. He's just drunk, that's all.
Cool down, Johnny. No! I want them spitting blood!
Easy, son, easy. Now ain't the time.
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequel, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtake. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 305, Tombstone. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And it's true, I am a good woman. Then again, I may be the Antichrist. Welcome to Verbal Diorama. Whether you're a brand new listener, whether you're a regular returning listener, whether you're just a huge fan of Westerns, thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. I am so happy to have you here for the history and legacy of Tombstone. And as always, a huge thanks to everyone who listens and supports this podcast and has continued to over the lifetime of this podcast, which is over 300 episodes now. So thank you so much for your support. It genuinely means so much. And this is the first Western that I've ever done on Verbal Diorama. And it really has been a long time coming, I guess, as so many episodes seem to be of this podcast. And there's no real reason why this is the first Western, other than I've only seen 2 in my entire life. So this is only the second Western that I've actually seen. It's not really a genre that clearly I watch very much of. As a British person, I think maybe Americans are more predisposed to watching Westerns. But yeah, it's really not been a genre that I've done that much on. So I'm really, really happy to actually be doing an episode on Tombstone, finally, because I have wanted to do an episode on Tombstone for some time. And the last episode was on Cutthroat Island. And there are so many links between this movie and that one, and also The Mummy as well, which is the greatest movie ever made. Last episode, I talked about Cutthroat Island being the patsy for a sinking studio, not the reason for the studio's demise. While Tombstone did great business for Hollywood Pictures and indeed Disney, it had its fair share of production problems and had a miraculous journey to the big screen, including getting made and released in just 7 months, losing its director a month into production, and finding its very own cowboy antagonist who tried several things to stop this movie even being made. Here's the trailer for Tombstone.
It was a place where a man could start over, where a fortune could be made. They say every town has a story. Tombstone has a legend.
Who is he?
That's Wyatt Earp. Better name for himself as a peace officer.
I heard of you.
I'm retired.
You must be Doc Holliday. You retired too?
Not me. I'm in my prime.
Hollywood Pictures presents
The only real law around here is the cowboys.
the story of Wyatt Earp.
The first time in our lives we got a chance to stop wandering and finally be a family. Now this is trouble we don't need.
If we're gonna have a future in this town, it's gotta have some law and order. What do you want, Ringo?
I want your blood. I want your soul. I want them both right now.
They shot your brother.
Now the time has come for justice.
Guess maybe you better swear me in.
And he has to live up to his reputation.
You got a fight coming.
I'll be there!
One last time.
None of your problem, Doc. You don't have to mix up in this.
That is a hell of a thing for you to say to me.
In a battle.
The last charge of Wyatt Earp and his immortals.
At the OK Corral.
Oh, my God.
The West would never forget. Kurt Russell. Val Kilmer. Dana Delaney. Powers Booth. Michael Biehn. Bill Paxton. Jason Priestley. Sam Elliott. And Charlton Heston.
You tell them I'm coming! And hell's coming with me!
Justice is coming to Tombstone.
After successfully cleaning up Dodge City, Kansas, ex-lawman Wyatt Earp moves to the silver mining town of Tombstone, Arizona, and wants to get rich in obscurity and retirement. He meets his brothers Virgil and Morgan there, as well as his old friend Doc Holliday. A band of outlaws that call themselves the Cowboys are causing problems with various acts of random violence and inevitably come into confrontation with Holliday and the Earps, which leads to a shootout at the OK Corral and the infamous Earp Vendetta ride. Let's quickly run through this cast, although it's not going to be quick because there's a lot of people in this movie. We have Kurt Russell as Wyatt Earp, Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, Sam Elliott as Virgil Earp, Bill Paxton as Morgan Earp, Powers Booth as Curly Bill Brocious, Michael Biehn as Johnny Ringo, Charlton Heston as Henry Hooker, Jason Priestley as Billy Breckenridge, John Tenney as Sheriff Johnny Behan, Stephen Lang as Ike Clanton, Thomas Hayden Church as Billy Clanton, Dana Delaney as Josephine Marcus. Also in there, Michael Rooker, Billy Bob Thornton, Billy Zane, John Corbett, Terry O'Quinn. This cast is stacked, and many of them I didn't actually recognise. Also in the cast, in a small role, is Wyatt Earp III as Billy Claiborne. More on him later. Robert Mitchum also narrates. Tombstone was written by Kevin Jarre and was directed by George P. Cosmatos. In 1877, the 30-year-old prospector Ed Schieffelin was working the hills east of the San Pedro River on land previously inhabited by the native Hoboken when he found pieces of silver ore in a dry wash. His friends had told him that the only rock he would find in the barren Arizona desert land would be his tombstone. Ed Schieffelin did indeed find Tombstone, and by March 1897, 100 residents occupied tents and shacks as 2 mines and a stamping mill were built. When Cochise County was formed in February 1881, Tombstone became the county seat. When Tombstone started to experience rapid growth, Ed's brother Al built Schieffelin Hall as a theatre, recital hall, and a meeting place for Tombstone citizens. Tombstone's population grew from 100 to around 14,000 in less than 7 years. Tombstone was only 30 miles from the US-Mexico border and was an open market for cattle stolen from ranches in Sonora, Mexico, by a loosely organised band of outlaws known as the Cowboys. Almost as quickly as it was established, Tombstone began known for being home of one of the most infamous showdowns in the West. The Earp brothers, the gunfight at the OK Corral, and the Earp Vendetta ride became synonymous with the town of Tombstone, and it made complete sense that Hollywood would take the story of a legendary lawman Wyatt Earp and ride with it. But it would take some time for Earp's story to resonate. The real Wyatt Earp lived to 80 years old in 1929, and he and his wife Sadie, aka Josephine Marcus, would spend their summers in Los Angeles. Earp would serve as a technical advisor on 1923's Wild Bill Hickok, and this was the first film to feature Wyatt Earp as a character on screen, albeit briefly played by Burt Lindley. Earp was interviewed for the 1928 book El Dorado, written by Billy Breckenridge, the former Tombstone deputy under John Behan, which had a less than flattering depiction of Earp and his brothers as thieves, pimps, crooked gamblers, and murderers, stating that the gunfight at the OK Corral was actually not a gunfight at all, but the unarmed cowboys surrendering to the Earps and being shot down in cold blood. After Wyatt Earp's death in 1929 and the publication of Stuart Lake's book, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, in 1931, Hollywood finally started to take notice of Wyatt Earp and his incredible stories, many of which came from Earp himself. He was not a humble man and took every effort to tell the tales of Tombstone and obviously picture himself in the most flattering light. Of course, it also helped that his third wife, Josephine Marcus, would threaten legal action to suppress certain parts of Earp's life after his death, controlling the narrative of his life and how he was depicted, i.e. not as a hard drinker, gambler or pimp, including suppressing his prior relationship with Mattie Blaylock, her own addiction to gambling, as well as details of her past life as an alleged child prostitute. After Marcus died in 1944, 15 years after Earp, she died penniless after gambling away much of their joint wealth, and the floodgates into the real story of Wyatt Earp opened. From early westerns like Frontier Marshal in 1939, the first film adaptation of Wyatt Earp's biography, Tombstone, The Town Too Tough to Die in 1942, starring Richard Dix, John Ford's My Darling Clementine in 1946, starring Henry Fonda as Wyatt Earp, Burt Lancaster starred in Gunfight at the OK Corral in 1957, and Hour of the Gun in 1967 starred James Garner in the role of Wyatt Earp. Earp has been a staple of Hollywood cinema in a long tradition of westerns, with each adaptation boosting the reputation of Earp as an American hero. And just like the pirate genre I talked about last episode, westerns have been a tradition in Hollywood going all the way back to the silent era, derived from the Wild West shows that began in the 1870s. One of the most famous and influential westerns of all time, though by no means the first, was The Great Train Robbery from 1903. The popularity of The Great Train Robbery led directly to the opening up of permanent Nickelodeon movie theatres and the possibility of a future film industry. Westerns dominated Hollywood from the 1930s through to the 1960s, becoming America's most distinctly personal, patriotic and national film genre. In 1939, John Ford directed Stagecoach, a movie that made the legendary John Wayne a star, and followed it up with Red River in 1948 and The Searchers in 1956 that explored darker themes. There was also High Noon in 1952, Gary Cooper's tense real-time western that served as an allegory for McCarthyism, Shane in 1953, the archetypal story of the reluctant gunfighter, which is also featured in the movie Logan, and the only other western that I'd ever seen, The Magnificent Seven in 1960, an American remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, and the ensemble western that became a template for action films. Westerns also infiltrated TV, with shows like Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and The Lone Ranger all becoming popular during this era. Instead of the genre dying in the 60s, it evolved into the spaghetti western, produced by Italian filmmakers with a distinct visual style, extreme close-ups, and stylized violence. The heroes were often morally ambiguous, and they were grittier in tone. Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy with Clint Eastwood, A Fistful of Dollars in 1964, For a Few Dollars More in 1965, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in 1966 redefined the genre. Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West in 1968 is considered the pinnacle of the spaghetti western. The Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement led to Americans renouncing traditional American values, and the westerns started to fall out of favour in the 70s with the rise of science fiction, horror, and contemporary drama. Kind of exactly what we saw last episode with the pirate genre, really. Hollywood wanted to tell stories of modern America that reflected the modern society of the 70s, not the society of the 1870s. By the time 1980 rolled around, the expensive Western epic Heaven's Gate became a critical and commercial disaster. And while a few Westerns in the 80s were modest successes, like Young Guns and Silverado, the genre seemingly was considered box office poison. And then in 1990, Dances with Wolves would be hugely successful, grossing $400 million on its $22 million budget and winning 7 of the 12 Oscars it was nominated for, including Best Picture and Best Director for star Kevin Costner, only the second Western at that time to win Best Picture. We are going to be coming back to Kevin Costner. Then 2 years later, Clint Eastwood's Best Picture Oscar-winning Unforgiven, which deconstructed the Western mythology and was not only critically acclaimed, but also commercially successful. Which brings us to 1993 and Tombstone. And the story of Tombstone starts with writer Kevin Jarre. Jarre also co-wrote the greatest movie ever made, The Mummy, in 1999, which would be his last writing credit. Jarre had grown up in and around the industry. His father was Academy Award-winning French film composer Maurice Jarre, who worked several times with director David Lean, and Jarre Jr. and Lean became friends. It was Lean who discouraged Kevin Jarre's acting career and encouraged his writing one. This led to Kevin Jarre writing Rambo First Blood Part 2, a Corralco movie. Yep, they're back again. This episode will have lots of links to Corralco. Rambo First Blood Part 2 was a phenomenal success and was directed by George P. Cosmatos. I am coming back to him too. In 1989, Kevin Jarre also wrote the screenplay for the award-winning film Glory. And as a history buff, Tombstone was a passion project for him. He wrote what many deemed an incredible script and was set to direct an ensemble cast of some of the finest actors in Hollywood. Studio politics gonna studio politics though, and Jarre's unceremonious removal and replacement as director of Tombstone should have been the end of the story of bringing Tombstone to life. But just like Earp himself, there's way more to the story, and the story starts with Kevin Costner. Now, we all know Costner brought his Wyatt Earp biopic, just called Wyatt Earp, to the big screen in 1994. It was focused on Earp throughout his life rather than the ensemble, and Kevin Jarre's script for Tombstone had been originally written with Costner in mind, and Costner was the first choice for the role of Wyatt Earp. Costner was coming off the back of critical and commercial smashes like Dances with Wolves and The Bodyguard, and was one of the biggest movie stars in the world. He eventually left the movie because he felt the story should focus on Earp, while Jarre's script was more of an ensemble. But Costner's involvement, and I use that in air quotes, didn't end there. After leaving Tombstone and starting work on his own adaptation, Costner allegedly used his influence in Hollywood to try to kill Tombstone by going to every major studio to convince them not to distribute Tombstone. When that didn't work and Tombstone got distribution at Hollywood Pictures via Disney's Buena Vista label, Costner bought all the available Western costumes in Hollywood for his film. At least 4 Westerns were in simultaneous pre-production at the time: Tombstone, Wyatt Earp, and both Geronimo and Geronimo, an American Legend. I'll come back to the costumes later, but it's safe to say that the alleged attempted sabotage backfired. Kevin Jarre's initial script was seen as a masterpiece. Westerns were starting to come back into vogue in Hollywood, and the script was the reason many of the actors signed on to the project. It was the involvement of Kurt Russell, though, that shaped Tombstone into Tombstone. Creative Artists Agency were backing Costner at the time, and the producers of Tombstone wanted a star big enough to satisfy any studio. When a William Morris agent clandestinely passed the script to CAA client Kurt Russell, he thought the script was incredible, and through Russell is where Andrew G. Vajna, previously of Corralco, now of Synergy Pictures, got involved. And Russell backed Jarre to direct the movie because Jarre's vision was that of a true Western aficionado, despite him having no directing experience. But while Costner left to make his own Wyatt Earp story, which was initially a premium cable series which morphed into a 3-hour epic, once writer-director Lawrence Kasdan came aboard, he realised Tombstone, as a movie about Wyatt Earp, was further along in the pipeline due to Synergy coming aboard, but it hadn't yet found a distributor. Meanwhile, Kurt Russell and Andrew G. Vajna had agreed that they would make Tombstone and they'd make it for $25 million. And this is where, again, allegedly, Costner began using his considerable clout in Hollywood to turn off studios who might offer Tombstone distribution, lest they get on Costner's bad side. He was one of the biggest actors of the late 80s and early 90s, after all. And on Tombstone's end, they'd already started considering casting for the major roles, including that of Doc Holliday, and the first choice for that role was Willem Dafoe. Tombstone was shopped around for distribution and every studio was saying no. The only studio who were willing to offer distribution for Tombstone was Disney's Hollywood Pictures, and with that option came certain stipulations, including not casting Dafoe. This led to Tombstone having no option but to forget Dafoe, get distribution with Hollywood Pictures, and go with their second choice, Val Kilmer. Now, some might say Kevin Costner forced them to make the best decision they could have possibly made, and it was a welcome return to Disney for Kurt Russell, who'd started his career with the studio as a child. But ultimately, despite Costner's attempts to stop Tombstone, Jar was ready to direct. Producers James Jacks and Sean Daniel, who also produced The Mummy, were ready to shoot, as long as they assembled a cast quickly. And the cast did fall into place quickly, with many falling in love with Jar's script, including Sam Elliott and Bill Paxton as Wyatt's brothers Virgil and Morgan. The other two Earp brothers, James and Warren, were left out of the script completely, and this is an incredible cast of both Hollywood legends like Charlton Heston and Robert Mitchum, established stars like Michael Biehn and Powers Booth, as well as up-and-comers like Jason Priestley and Thomas Hayden Church. Jar wrote the role of Josephine Marcus for his girlfriend at the time, Lisa Zane. The role would go to Dana Delaney, but Lisa's brother Billy Zane would get a role instead. The actors all grew period-appropriate moustaches and waxed them according to historical photographs, all except John Tennis, who had to be clean-shaven for his previous project, and so he had the only fake moustache in the movie. But you can't have an authentic Western without authentic costumes, and like everything else on Tombstone, the production was competing with other films, most notably Kevin Costner's Wyatt Earp. And Costner, while his movie started shooting 2 months after Tombstone, had already swiped up all the available Western costumes in Hollywood for his film. Unperturbed, the Tombstone team went to Europe, which was actually where the nouveau riche of the West in the 1880s actually bought their clothes. It would slightly increase the costume budget, but it also meant genuinely authentic period clothing, in all colours, including lime greens and purples. Tombstone's production designer was Catherine Hardwicke. She would go on to become a director herself, and she wanted to eschew the traditional sepia tones of other westerns. The costume designer was Joseph Porro, and he experienced this lack of authentic clothing in the US firsthand when he tried to rent hats within the US, but they were either all gone or the companies wouldn't do business with Tombstone. So his only option was to make stuff. And to do that, he enlisted a group of period authentic reenactors, led by Peter Shireko, called the Buckaroos. The Buckaroos were a group of amateur historians and provided casting services as extras, either as cowboys, soldiers, or townspeople. They also provided wardrobe, guns, ammunition, technical advice, horses, and special effects. Each member of the Buckaroos had their own authentic costumes and huge collections of artifacts and libraries full of books on westerns. They also owned huge collections of authentic weapons, including rifles, shotguns, and pistols, and they were incredibly skilled markspeople with well-trained horses, and it was their attention to detail that led to Joseph Porro manufacturing new costumes in downtown LA, taking those designs from the members of the Buckaroos, hiring a Filipino shirt maker to make 300 detailed shirts, with Stetson providing 100 hats. The Montana Boot Company provided 20 pairs of stovepipe and Coffeyville boots. Nothing was made at any costume house, but some items like the ladies' dresses were rented from Europe. Jar wanted an authentic Western in all aspects, specifically to capture the affluent, colourful Victorian look of a cosmopolitan boomtown in the 1880s. And although some claim that the red sashes of the cowboys are just gang colours or just to identify them and they're not accurate, Joseph Porro claims the sashes were period correct. The period trousers normally didn't contain belt loops and braces, and galluses and suspenders always got in the way. So sashes were often used as belts on high-waisted trousers. They also protected fabric from gun oil, and they were also probably inspired by the sash worn by Kevin Jarre's hero, Wild Bill Hickok. Once again, Costner's attempt to sabotage Tombstone backfired. Filming on Tombstone began in May 1993 around Tucson, Arizona, around 70 miles from the actual Tombstone, with an immovable Christmas 1993 release date. Immovable because they knew Costner's Wyatt Earp was scheduled for June 1994, and they wanted to beat that movie to the punch by 6 months. The date could not move, else they might as well create a tombstone for Tombstone. And Kevin Jarre really wanted his directorial debut to be precise, inspired by the classic westerns directed by John Ford. He wanted his movie to have beautiful wide shots. He had a vision in his head to emulate the classic westerns of old. He didn't want to do close-up shots. Instead, he would give precise line readings to his actors, explaining how the vision in his mind matched the script. But this also led to problems because he would ignore the advice of his experienced cinematographer, 6-time Oscar nominee William Fraker. His actors were filming in wool costumes in 110-degree Fahrenheit heat, in the shade, not even in the sunshine. 110-degree Fahrenheit heat is 43 degrees Celsius for us Brits, and that was just in the shade. We've just had a mini heat wave here in the UK with 32 degrees Celsius, and trust me, that is hot enough for any British person. These issues would lead to take after take after take. Jarre was clearly overwhelmed and filming was falling behind schedule. The pace was slow, the crew was frustrated, and time was ticking. They needed a director who could deliver the goods quickly. After just a few weeks on the job, Kevin Jarre was removed as director. Now, some say a handful of his scenes do exist in the finished movie, others say nothing exists. He directed the scenes with Charlton Heston. Heston ends up only making a cameo appearance in the movie because Jarre's shots of Heston as prominent rancher Henry Clay Hooker never actually made it into the final version. Jarre's original script had Hooker backing the Earps, and all of that footage still exists, but more on that later. But also, the producers knew that Jarre was inexperienced and didn't really give him much time to learn the necessary craft, just threw him in at the proverbial deep end of the swimming pool. Jarre was understandably devastated to lose Tombstone. A year before, Universal had shelved his planned Dracula screenplay when Francis Ford Coppola announced his version, the sublime Bram Stoker's Dracula. But Jarre's unceremonious removal led to the need for a new director quick sharpish, and after considering John Milius and John McTiernan, among others, this is where George P. Cosmatos comes back into the story. He'd worked with Kevin Jarre before on Rambo First Blood Part 2, and he was recommended through Kurt Russell's friend Sylvester Stallone. He arrived on set with only 3 days preparation. It was well documented that Cosmatos wasn't the easiest person to get on with, depending on who you were. He was demanding and had conflicts with pretty much everyone, including cinematographer William Fraker, who quit 3 times and had to be persuaded to return by producer James Jacks. 17 other crew members, including 2 script supervisors and half the art department, left for other jobs, quit outright, or were fired by Cosmatos. Now, the legend is that Cosmatos was a ghost director at best, and Kurt Russell really directed the movie, which has been all but confirmed by Russell since Cosmatos' death, as well as being backed up by Val Kilmer. Russell refused an official director's credit, but since they needed an official director and they needed to get cracking on finishing this movie, Russell stepped up in more ways than a lead actor would usually, including trimming down the script extensively, reducing some roles and stories, including his own lead role, in favour of a more narrow focus on the friendship between Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. And this decision, obviously boosted by Costner, forcing their hands to end up hiring Val Kilmer, would actually lead to Tombstone becoming legendary. While Russell was the one setting shot lists and editing the script, he also knew that by elevating Kilmer, who was more or less a method actor on this movie, he'd actually be elevating the movie. With some cracking one-liners and a constant appearance of pale, sweaty, tuberculosis-ridden cool, Val Kilmer simply is Tombstone. And when Russell and Kilmer riff off each other, it's truly great. their partnership came at the cost of other roles and storylines which were dramatically cut. Sam Elliott stated that if he'd been offered the amended final shooting script for Tombstone instead of Kevin Jarre's original, he would have declined the role. Tombstone finally wrapped filming on the 29th of August 1993 after 88 days of shooting. They had less than 4 months to get this movie in the can, and in the edit, the removal of key scenes from the script were apparent. The Earp vendetta ride was particularly affected, as in Jarre's original script, the action scenes were anchored in explicit context to make the movie more dramatically meaningful and informed the audience as to who exactly is being killed by the Earp party. In the final cut, it's more a montage of random character deaths, and this was never as Jarre intended. Also removed was much of the love story between Wyatt Earp and Josephine Marcus, including a sex scene after their horse race, and much of Marcus's story completely, including the love triangle between her, Earp and Sheriff Bean, which led to much of the tension between the two men in real life. The women in this story are severely underserved, and much of this was simply removal from the script after Jarre left. Before this, most of the wives had more to do, as did Big Nose Kate. Wyatt Earp III is credited in this movie as Billy Claiborne, and while it is a stage name, it has an authenticity to it. Glenn Wyatt Earp, aka Wyatt Earp III, shares a common ancestor with the Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp III is the 5th cousin of Wyatt Earp. None of the Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil or Morgan, had sons. Virgil had one daughter. However, they had an older half-brother, Newton Earp, and Wyatt Earp III is a direct descendant of Newton Earp. Back to the footage shot by Jarre and all of the footage cut out of the finished movie. It exists. It's referred to as the Western Godfather, and it exists in the most obvious place. A tape was given by Andrew G. Vajna to Kurt Russell, with the express permission for Russell to reconstruct the movie in the future if he wished. After the passings of George P. Cosmatos in 2005 and Kevin Jarre in 2011, Russell has the ability to create a new director's cut, but when asked whether he'd do it, he replied in an interview with True West magazine that he has a life, and someday he might, but right now, living his life is more important. And props to the guy for realising that maybe he prefers to spend his 70s doing other stuff than making a director's cut Tombstone. As well as playing his cards close to his chest and not disrespecting the memories of the people who are credited for Tombstone. And of course now, with Val Kilmer having passed last year in 2025, it doesn't really make sense to give us a different Tombstone because the original is so iconic because of Kilmer. Kilmer would go on to name his autobiography, I'm Your Huckleberry. He'd also confirm it means, I'm your man, you've met your match. While the majority of the story in Tombstone is true, including miraculously that Wyatt Earp was never hit once by any bullet fired at him, there are some things in this movie that aren't completely accurate. The main characters were real people. Wyatt Earp, his brothers Virgil and Morgan, Doc Holliday, Johnny Ringo, and the various members of the Cowboy Gang all existed and were involved in the historical events depicted. The line from Doc Holliday, "You're a daisy if you do," is pulled from real newspaper reports. Less accurate is the timeline, which compresses several years of events into what happens to be in close succession, and nor was Johnny Ringo's death at the hands of Doc Holliday. Ringo apparently died by suicide in July 1882. But what is pretty much always accurate is the obligatory Keanu reference. And this is the part of the podcast where I try and link the movie that I'm featuring with Keanu Reeves for no reason other than he is the best of men. And who knows, in a different version of the timeline, he may have appeared in Tombstone. And this is a really simple obligatory Keanu reference because, as I mentioned, Kevin Jarre never got to make his Dracula movie. But instead we got Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, which obviously starred Keanu Reeves in a role that a lot of people say is one of his worst, but I don't believe that. I actually think it's all right. It's just a dodgy accent. But, you know, we forgive lots of people for dodgy accents. Everyone forgave Dick Van Dyke for that dodgy accent in Mary Poppins a long time ago. I think it's time we all start to forgive and forget the dodgy accent Keanu Reeves gave us in Dracula. But seriously, Bram Stoker's Dracula is a truly outstanding movie in every respect. And while Kevin Jarre gave us The Mummy, which is the greatest movie ever made, and I would be interested to see what he would have done with a version of Dracula, I'm never going to take any version of Dracula that doesn't give us Keanu Reeves as Jonathan Harker. Just quickly on the music for Tombstone, the score was composed and produced by Bruce Broughton and performed by the Sinfonia of London. And because this was a non-union production, it was actually David Snell who conducted most of the score. Patricia Carlin was the music editor, and despite them not actually having a great deal of time to get Tombstone filmed and post-production completed, miraculously Tombstone did release on time. On the 24th of December 1993, it debuted at third at the US box office behind Mrs. Doubtfire, which had been out 6 weeks. This was at number 1, The Pelican Brief was at number 2, but Tombstone was nothing if not consistent, and stayed at third for a total of 3 weeks. Still following Mrs. Doubtfire and The Pelican Brief, Tombstone dropped to 7th in its 4th week, before exiting the top 10 in its 7th week. Most importantly, it beat Wyatt Earp to cinemas with a 6-month head start, and that would prove pretty crucial to the everlasting legacy of both movies. On its $25 million budget, Tombstone grossed $56.5 million domestically in the US and $16.7 million internationally, for a total worldwide gross of $73.2 million. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has a score of 76%, and its critical consensus reads, "If you're seeking a stylish modern western with a solid story and a well-chosen ensemble cast, Tombstone is your huckleberry." While Roger Ebert would recommend the movie, Gene Siskel would not. The pair struggled to find a critic screening, but they kept hearing about this movie. Ebert would say, quote, "A strange thing started to happen. People started telling me they really liked Val Kilmer's performance in Tombstone, and I heard this everywhere I went. When you hear this once or twice, it's interesting. When you hear it a couple of dozen times, it's a trend. And when you read that Bill Clinton loved the performance, you figured you better catch up with the movie," unquote. Ebert would continue to highlight the movie in other reviews of Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer movies, saying, quote, "Every time I see Russell or Val Kilmer in a role, I'm reminded of their Tombstone, which got lost in the year-end holiday shuffle and never got the recognition it deserved," unquote. Tombstone was named one of the 5 greatest westerns ever made by True West magazine, which has contained a wealth of information that I've been able to gain for this episode, so a huge thank you to True West magazine. Now, remarkably, no one got any Oscar nods for this movie, not even Val Kilmer's career best performance. He had to make do with an MTV Award nomination for Best Male Performance and Most Desirable Male. Never has consumption looked so sexy. Kevin Jarre's original Tombstone script is almost as mythologized as the original events themselves. You'll hear many historians and experts stating it was Shakespearean, the most historically accurate telling of the Tombstone tale, and a lost masterpiece. And maybe we will see that version someday. But the truth of Jarre's original script is simply that, in its existing form, it was unfilmable. Certainly how Jarre chose to direct it. Removing him from Tombstone was the only way they were going to save Tombstone. And they did indeed save Tombstone. Tombstone aims to portray Wyatt Earp and his family as the heroes and the cowboys as the villains in a clearly black and white portrayal. The reality is that Wyatt Earp was not a pure-hearted soul out to do the right thing. Wyatt Earp was not a great person. His reputation in history is based on his own self-promotion in early 20th century Hollywood, not from him actually being a good human. But that doesn't make for an interesting Hollywood story of good versus evil. Maybe Billy Breckenridge's book actually had some truth to it, but Hollywood westerns have always romanticized the Old West, and the gunfight at the OK Corral is legendary for good reason. As I mentioned, this is the first western I've ever done on this podcast, and only the second western I've ever seen after The Magnificent Seven, which I also really enjoyed. I'm not really a fan of westerns, but so far it's 2 for 2 on the genre for me. And I do think it's important for a podcast to mix up the genres sometimes. I've never seen Costner and Kasdan's Wyatt Earp, and to be honest, I probably won't. But it's safe to say that while Costner's movie is a 3-hour epic that focuses strictly on Wyatt Earp himself, it just didn't have the stamina or charisma of Tombstone. It was a box office failure and was compared unfavourably to Tombstone by critics. It's a real shame because it has a stellar cast as well, including Dennis Quaid, Gene Hackman, Michael Madsen, Catherine O'Hara, Bill Pullman and Isabella Rossellini. It would also get an Oscar nomination for Best Cinematography. But despite all of the issues surrounding Kevin Jarre and his original vision, we shouldn't take from what's actually here on screen a really great Western. Tombstone, given its onset issues, shouldn't be cohesive. It shouldn't work. The fact it succeeded not only in the early 90s, but still resonates 30 years later and is still winning over new audiences, myself included, is a remarkable testament to the strength of Kevin Jarre's initial vision, the strong cast he pulled together, and the desire of everyone involved to get this movie made, even after Kevin Jarre was removed from the movie. While the Western resurgence of the early 90s eventually faded away, Tombstone has not only survived, but thrived. And I think it's worth pointing out we need to give the late Kevin Jarre his dues. Many articles slate him for his inexperience and scapegoat him for being the sole source of the movie's problems. Really, the producer should have realised much sooner that he didn't have the experience to turn around a big Western in just a few months. We have to properly recognise Kevin Jarre's accomplishments. Like Cutthroat Island last week, Kevin Jarre was set up to fail, but he was also ultimately responsible for the authenticity on screen and for assembling a truly terrific cast that have become synonymous with these real-life characters. Kurt Russell simply is Wyatt Earp. Val Kilmer is Doc Holliday. It's also worth adding that Wyatt's farewell to Doc in the sanatorium at the end absolutely never happened. Wyatt and Doc last met in Denver, Colorado in the winter of 1886. Doc would move into the Hotel Glenwood in Glenwood Springs, California in September 1887 and succumb to tuberculosis in November 1887. And honestly, tuberculosis was really contagious, so not only is it a miracle that Wyatt Earp was never struck by any bullet, it's also miraculous that none of the Earp brothers caught tuberculosis. Luckily, with the advent of antibiotics, TB is a rare bacterial disease nowadays in most of the developed world. But back then, it would have been seriously infectious. This movie succeeds where it shouldn't, but also where it should. And that's on Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer. In Kilmer's autobiography, he said, quote, "One way or another, Americans have to deal with the West and its glorious, sordid, sadistic past. We fought lawlessness to create an even more lawless law, one that excused and perpetuated genocide. Even today, this gun-obsessed nation that we love remains mired in a dilemma centred on pistols and rifles with romantic ties to our murderous past. We love Westerns, we learn everything from Westerns, and yet learn nothing from them. We continue killing ourselves in an unconscionable way. That's why when I had the chance to play Doc Holliday, I grabbed it," unquote. Kilmer mentioned on his blog how much he loved the experience of working on Tombstone and working with Kurt Russell. He also championed Russell constantly as the sole reason Tombstone was successful. The pair would live together for a brief period, with Kilmer moving in with Russell and sleeping on his sofa while Goldie Hawn was out of town, just so they could work on the script or schedule for the next day. This is undoubtedly Russell's movie in so many ways, but also undoubtedly Kilmer's. It's the movie that got him the underrated gig as Batman in Batman Forever. When he passed last year, everyone was talking about Tombstone, and now I know why. While Kurt Russell is the man with the power to create a director's cut of Tombstone, I don't think we need it. Tombstone's legacy is as set as Wyatt Earp's himself. Controlled, managed, somewhat staged, but with a reputation to match its badassery. Tombstone is the classic modern Western, and that's a pretty good epitaph. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Tombstone, and as always, thank you for your continued support of this podcast. If you want to get involved and help this podcast grow, that would be amazing, and I would be so very grateful. You could leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast. You can find me and follow me. I'm at Verbal Diorama across social media. Come and talk to me about Tombstone or any episode that I've ever put out. I am more than happy to talk about previous episodes of this podcast. You can also like posts, comment on posts, share posts. It all helps across social media to get the visibility of this podcast out there. Or you can simply just tell your friends and family about this podcast and about this episode. So, the next episode of this podcast is actually another movie that has been a long time coming for this podcast. This month, I kind of dubbed it It's About Time month, because these are movies that I've wanted to feature on the podcast for a while. They may have been put into the schedule kind of temporarily. They may have been moved out and replaced by something else. And the next movie is a prime example of a movie that's been put on the schedule so many times and then removed in favour of something else. And I thought to myself, do you know what? I actually really enjoy this movie. It's got so many plot holes. It's kind of frustrating to watch in a way. However, the two leads of this movie are so charismatic and the chemistry is so great that chemistry would spill out into real life, and these two people would end up becoming one of the biggest celebrity couples of the 2000s. And of course, the movie that I'm talking about is Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The two people are Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, and it has been a long time coming to this podcast. So please join me next week for the history and legacy of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now, if you enjoy what I do for this podcast and you simply want to support an indie podcaster who does everything herself, if you have some spare change, you can financially contribute to the upkeep of this podcast. Now, you're under no obligation because this podcast is free and it always will be free. However, if you do get value out of what I do, there are a couple of ways you can help. You can make a one-off donation at verbaldiorama.com/tips, or you can go to the Patreon and you can subscribe at verbaldiorama.com/Patreon. And all money made goes back into this podcast by paying for subscriptions, hosting, and new equipment. Huge thank you to the amazing patrons of this podcast. They are Simon, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Ian, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, So, Kev, Heather, Danny, Stu, Brett, Philip M, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, Philip K, Adam, Elaine, Kyle, and Aaron. If you want to get in touch, you can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com. You can also go to verbaldiorama.com and you can fill out the little contact form. And you can basically say hello, you can give me feedback or suggestions. And like I say, please feel free to get in touch and talk about this movie or literally any other movie that I've ever featured. I'm definitely going to have something to say about every movie that I've ever featured on this podcast. And like I say, there's over 300 of them, so plenty of opportunities to talk. And finally,
Well, I didn't think you had it in you.
I'm your huckleberry. Why, Johnny Ringo. You look like somebody just walked over your grave.
Fight's not with you, Holliday.
I beg to differ, sir. We started a game we never got to finish. Play for blood, remember?
I was just fooling about.
I wasn't. And this time, it's legal.
All right, Lunger. Let's do it.
Say when.
Johnny. Come on! You're no Daisy. You're no Daisy at all.
Poor soul. He was just too high-strung.
I'm afraid the strain was more than he could bear.
Bye.
Movies you know, movies you